on the first topic for today, reading poverty and what schools can't do about it. I titled the presentation this way because I think a lot of our project is about, how do we help students who don't naturally have the resources to read, learn to read, and to want to read. And if you look at the title, what schools can't do about it, actually the apostrophe T is in brackets. Okay, it really is an optimistic talk. I want us today to think about what schools can do about it, as well as, how as a community we can work on things together. Maybe I just start a little bit with my own interest in the topic, how I sort of became interested in this topic, or how this topic is something that really is important to me. I think a lot of who we are is part of the history of how we came to be, right? And from my paternal side, my grandmother was a school principal, but on my mother's side of the family, she did not come from such a well-to-do family, and I had cousins who did not finish school at that time, and I could see among the 8 sisters the different trajectories that all the cousins had with their past in terms of their access to education. And of course, for myself, with my dad's side very focused on education, my mother herself being focused on education, we sort of got the home environment to encourage reading. And now, of course, the context is very different, right? It's a very different Singapore we live in compared to the Singapore that I grew up in. We have a lot more parents who are able to send their children to classes, who are able to give the home resources to certain students. And it's in this context that I'm focusing on this topic. So just to start off, let us clarify our definition of reading. Reading, for our purposes, is the meaningful decoding of print or online text. So we're very liberal with our definition of reading. It includes both print and online text. And the idea is that it needs to be for the purposes of pleasure, learning, achieving one's goals, and participating in society. So you read for a variety of reasons. And why reading and poverty? Reading and poverty, because children with different social backgrounds, we've got research from the US, from the UK that tells you children with different social backgrounds have differential access to reading resources and role models. They have less books at home. They may have less access to libraries in certain countries, not in Singapore. They may have less role models. For example, if your mother is university educated, and your mother is not university educated, that makes a big difference to the kind of home resource you have. And poor students with less exposure to literacy-rich environments and experiences are at greater risk of becoming poor readers themselves. Now, the key thing is, the point here is that reading and poverty in developed countries is different from reading and poverty in non-developed countries. One of the things that the research has actually shown is that the gap between the rich and poor is actually more pronounced in developed countries, because middle-class parents basically have more resources in terms of capital, so money. In terms of time, a mother who can stay at home is actually a great resource, or a mother who knows the right materials to buy to help the child. And networks, we know people. I have aunties who can come in to help. I know someone who can, suggest a book to my child. Those are networks to cultivate the child's reading proficiency. Whereas in a country that is not as developed, in that sense, everybody has that equal resource. In Singapore particularly, there is a large gap between the top and bottom 10% of students. And one of the most interesting or rather surprising things is that although we topped PISA 2015, if you look closely at the PISA data, between 2009 to 2015, our high performers have gotten better, but our low performers have remained the same. So it's not too bad. They didn't get worse, but they've remained the same. But the problem is that the gap between the poor performers and high performers have increased. So that is a big issue. How do we help these low performers improve on their performance? In the study itself, how do we measure poverty? We use students on the financial assistance scheme as a measure of poverty. So if you read the fine details, which I know you can't because it's too small, a student is eligible for financial assistance if the gross household income does not exceed $2,500 a month, or per capita income does not exceed $625 a month. That works out to $7,500 a year. So I did a little check on the gross capital income of Singaporeans, and it's about 80,000. So we're talking about the average Singaporean bringing home 7,500 a month versus somebody who's surviving on 7,500 a year. Okay, so we used FAS as an indicator. It's still a rough indicator. We're not capturing students who do not fall into the FAS bracket, but who need help anyway. We also rely on students' self-reported data on number of books owned. There's research that shows that that's a good indicator of socioeconomic status, and to a lesser extent, parents' educational background. So from the study itself, what have we learned about reading and poverty? I think the first thing that we have learned is that students on financial assistance have less books at home. If you look at this graph here, the one in orange is students who are on financial assistance. The one in blue is students who are not on financial assistance. So 4 out of 10 students on FAS have 10 books or less at home. In contrast, if you look at students who have more than 100 books, so 7.6% here to 19.4%, so almost 2 out of 10 students have more than 100 books at home. And then again, 51 to 100, you can see that students who are not on FAS have a lot more books at home. So that's one area where students on FAS have less. FAS students are also less likely to have parents, more likely to have parents who do not read at home and so may not be the role models for reading. If you look at this FAS, students who do, parents, we ask the students to indicate whether they see their parents reading and if they did what they saw their parents reading. So for students on FAS, 18.6% do not see their parents reading in comparison to about 11% for non-FAS students. We also asked them what types of materials they saw their parents reading, and we gave 4 types: fiction, non-fiction, newspapers, and magazines. And if you look at it, FAS students, a lot of them said one type. Typically, it would be the newspapers. Whereas non-FAS students, there were more parents who read different types of reading materials. Now, why is this important? It's important because if you see your parents reading different kinds of reading materials, you begin to understand that, hey, you know, I can read to find out about things. I can read for pleasure. There are different ways to access information. Okay, so the number of types of reading materials is important for that reason. Now, one of the common arguments that we often have in Singapore is that we have a great public library system. So our students can access books anytime. And I agree, we have a great public library system. If you look at this, we have basically one national library, 26 public libraries, which are distributed all over Singapore. One of the things that we did in our research was that we tried to track, we said, you know, does every Singaporean student have access to a library? Is it within walking or busing distance? So using this as this is one of our case study schools. So the schools are here in the same region. One of them is an IP school, one of them is a co-ed government school. But you can see that within 2 kilometers, that's the circle, they have access to 2 public libraries, 3 bookstores, and just outside the circle, they've got more bookstores as well. So in terms of actual busing distance, you know, students do have access to public libraries. But one of the things that we tried to do is figure out, were these students actually using the resources that were available to them? And one of the things we found was that students who identify as readers are able to travel further for books. So for example, in our interviews with students who said they were readers, often they would say, you know, we go to Kinokuniya to look for books. We go online to look for books. Whereas for those who identify themselves as non-readers, they tend not to travel for books. They don't see reading as a form of entertainment, so they wouldn't travel for it. Now, if you look at this invisible network of resources here, I developed this a long time ago when I was looking at good readers. And the idea is that most good readers have certain resources to help them become good readers. For example, home, they have reading parents or siblings to support them. Peers, they have friends who read. They can access a library. There are primary schools that support reading. There are bookstores and other media. Now, it's interesting that it has changed because formerly when we looked at other media, I was just looking at things like, were they watching movies online that were book-related? But now when we think about media, we think about technology, things like Wattpad, which is an online series that kids can access to read. They read on, for example, Instagram. So technology, reading online is an important aspect of reading now. So from our interviews, what we learned from the students is that those who are readers, they have a lot of home resources. This is just an illustration. So Nathalie here, an example, says, my sister, my mother, and myself, we try to go to the library at least once a month. Like when our books expire, we will go to the library. So readers are very familiar with the library because from a young age, their parents bring them to the library. They know where to get books, how to get books. They know how to use the OPEC system to access books. And it's a family activity. They come here to entertain themselves, to borrow books. One of the interesting things we also found is that readers borrow a lot of books from the public library, but that non-readers, they come here to study more than to borrow books. So it's interesting when you see their patterns, what they use the library for. Bookstores, I like Kinokuniya. I just like it because they have a lot of books, more than popular. And they also have the main one in Orchard Road, which is very big and fun because you get to walk around. Going to a bookstore is fun. And one of the things that we found in our interviews, we interviewed 12 to 18 students in each school from various streams. And one of the things we found is that those who are readers will tell you, I go to Popular at Bras Basah to get Chinese books, or I go to Kinokuniya to get more books. We have things like, I buy books on Kindle. You can get them from Amazon. Say they tell us things like this. Reading peers. So peers are very important. Here's a memory of getting hooked into reading because a friend was reading The Fault in Our Stars and she said, well, that's an exciting book. And finally, reading became exciting for this student. Other media, I like reading some of the stories on Wattpad. So again, this is a very interesting finding for us because I think one of the common arguments we have is that students can read online. So why do we provide them with books, print books? We find that students who are readers, when they go online, they will read long stretches of text online. So for example, Wattpad, they can follow series, stories that other people are writing. So they read these stories. They're able to read extended text online as well. On the other hand, for those who say they are non-readers, they tend to have less home resources. So in this case, this girl from another school says, from the normal technical stream says, my sister has some Malay horror books. I don't see my parents reading. So the siblings are very important. If the siblings bring books home, they get to read. But the parents don't read, so she has to depend on other sources for reading. The last time I went to the library was last week to borrow a book from Mass Borrowing. I did not borrow anything. So even when they go to the library, it's very functional. It's to do something. But because they're very unfamiliar with the library, again, they exit the library without borrowing the books. I don't really go to the bookstore, but if I did, it would be to get textbooks, right? So they don't think about buying different kinds of books. This particular student is interesting because she comes from a school where there's no focus on reading for pleasure. So the focus is more on intensive reading. So that's her comment. Nobody in school is reading a book. Everyone is on their phone. They would rather read Instagram stories. So when we deprive the children of print, I'm thinking we might be depriving them of the chance to read longer stretches of text. Because if they're reading on their phones, and they're not readers, they may just read short pieces of text. I love this. Actually, I don't love it. I got a shock when I heard this. What is a Kindle? But that speaks about myself as well, that I'm not aware of what other people don't have or do not know because I know what a Kindle is. I use it. I have one, so I assume everyone has one. But here's a student asking me, what is a Kindle? And I suspect many of our students will not know as well. Readers and non-readers also tend to respond differently to strategies to get them read. And in 3 of the research schools that we had, they utilized the mass borrowing that NLB organizes. And so it was really good to see, NLB bringing 3,000 to 5,000 books to each of these schools to sort of put them out for students to borrow so that they would have a greater variety. But what was interesting again was that different kinds of readers responded to it differently. So for the avid readers, they actually make decisions about which library to go to. And when they go to the library, they actually borrow books. So this girl says, because I feel like Bishan actually has more books than Ang Mo Kio, so I just took the time to go there, travel a little bit further to what she feels is a better library, return the book, and then borrowed another book or a few more books. This is the same quote. The last time I went to the library was last week to return a book. So they went because, they were forced to borrow a book. Teacher said, you have to borrow a book, then you'll go to the library. But when they go to the library, they return the book. They usually do step in. Then they leave because they're not very familiar. They don't know where to look for books, and they're not inclined to do it as well. What was, I suppose, even more terrible for some of the students is that their books become overdue, and they get a fine, and then they never return to the library because they don't pay that fine, and they worry about coming to the library. And for the competent reader, but someone who's not a very valid, avid reader, they may come to the library to borrow books. They see it as a place where I get books if I need them, but it's not to feed my reading habit. So how can schools help equalize reading resources and access? And at this point, I'll just sort of break the talk out into 3 different parts. Okay, but before that, one of the interesting things that happened in our interviews was that we discovered that students who were readers were often able to share a memory of reading about somebody who read to them, or an enjoyable memory of reading. Okay, and for students who were readers but did not come from reading homes, the school was particularly important. So in the interview, we would ask the student, are you a reader? Are you not a reader? So the students say, okay, I'm a reader. Then we'll just ask, why do you consider yourself a reader? Or why do you consider yourself a non-reader? And we found that people who identify as readers, they tended to be able to share about a memory of school. So either they shared about a memory of their home or a memory of school that was important. So in this case, my primary 5 teacher, I always see her reading in the hall or when we're doing our homework. Charles is wondering whether this teacher should be reading when students are doing the homework, but she's still setting a good example, I think. Okay, but even for good readers in secondary schools, they benefit from having reading teachers. So this is from one of the girls, okay, talking about their teacher and observing that the teacher reads widely. And we hear this. We hear this from the students, Miss So-and-so doesn't read, our teachers don't read, or our teachers do read. And how do they know teachers read? Because teachers are knowledgeable, teachers talk about books in the classroom. So 3 ways that I want to suggest that we can build a reading school that we need to think about. The first is to focus on reading engagement. Secondly, put time aside for reading. And thirdly, create reading libraries. So I'll just focus on the first one for now. One of the things about research, what that research has shown, is that engaged reading is correlated to academic achievement. I want to point out that the key word here is engage. It's not more reading, it's not functional reading, it's not reading comprehension. Okay, so reading comprehension is not correlated to academic achievement, but engaged reading. And engaged reading is when students independently pick up books and they want to read for themselves. So there's an element of choice there. Okay, and research has also suggested that engaged reading trumps socioeconomic status when it comes to reading proficiency. So in research from the Netherlands as well as research from the UK, centering around the idea of cultural capital, they measure, these are quantitative research where they actually look at students' reading habits as well as parents' university level, their socioeconomic status. And one of the things that they found is consistent is that usually it's the reading habit at home, or in this case, that is more important than the parents' socioeconomic status. So it doesn't matter that you come from a poor home if you come from a reading home. So I think one of the things that we need to change in terms of our mindset when it comes to reading in our current exam-oriented system, exam-oriented more because of the whole history of how things are worked out here, is that we need to begin to think about reading as something that we need to get students interested in. Okay, Lucy McCulkin says this: teaching reading then begins with helping children to want the life of a reader and envision that life for himself. So how do we provide opportunities for students to want the life of a reader for themselves? So how do we motivate students to read? What is also interesting from the research is that we asked the students why they read. And the great majority of the students say that they would rather read for pleasure than for functional reasons. So functional reasons included things like I read to improve my grades, I read to improve my language, as opposed to things like I read for enjoyment, it's my hobby, I want to relax. So most students prefer to read for pleasure. What is also interesting in the data is that the higher proficiency students are more likely to say they read for pleasure, whereas the lower proficiency students are more likely to say that they read for functional reasons. I need to read to get better at my work, at my grades. So the question I have is this: schools have a tendency, and I hope it's changing, to focus on reading proficiency measured by students' abilities to do well on comprehension tests. Can schools evaluate whether their curriculum, instructional methods, and programs are also designed to encourage self-motivated reading? How do we encourage schools to motivate students? And how do we measure motivation? I don't have the answer to that. I'm just raising the question for us to think about. If reading motivation is a big part of what we want our students to do, what in the system or what within the school allows us to tell us that we're moving in the right direction. Okay, because it's a lot harder to measure than grades. Yeah. The second thing for building a reading school is to put time aside for reading. I think one of the interesting things from the preliminary findings for us is that when you put time aside for reading, students do absorb some of that interest in reading. I say that because we're all familiar with sustained silent reading, where the school sets aside time for students to read. Sometimes it's done in the classroom, sometimes it's done in assembly halls. And sometimes as teachers walking around, we are uncertain whether students are actually reading because they're holding the same book, they're holding the book upside down, or they're complaining. And I had that question as well. Does it make a difference, to put aside time for reading? Well, the research has convinced me that somehow I think it does. In 4 of the government schools that we did in our research in, 2 of the schools have sustained silent reading in the morning. 1 of them does not have sustained silent reading, but they have reading programs in school. And the 4th school did not have any sustained silent reading or any programs to encourage reading. Across all 6 schools, what we discovered was what we call the Sec 3 dip. We asked this question: do you enjoy reading? And in Sec 1 and Sec 2, more students enjoy reading. And in Sec 3, there's the Sec 3 dip, because they've got to cope with the exams and they just find that they have no time to read. They stop enjoying their reading. But the interesting thing was, out of all the 4 government schools that we looked at, in the school that did not have any sustained silent reading or encouragement of reading through a reading program, there was a Sec 2 dip. So in Sec 2, the students, between Sec 1 to Sec 2, there was actually a large number of students who just said they didn't like reading anymore or didn't like reading. So that was interesting for us. But these are some of the notes from students during the interviews. We asked them, is your school a reading school, or do you see yourself as a reader? And this girl from the NT class, Sec 2 NT class, says, I guess we're all readers in this school because during morning assembly, we take 35 minutes to read. Another person says, this is a boy, I used not to read, but since I came to secondary school, I started to come to the library many times. I will take a book and read it. And again, even for high proficiency students, they benefit from it because in this case, the student says, I've got no time to read, I'm too busy. I appreciate having some time set aside for reading. Now, having said this, of course, I don't want to give the impression that, just because you're sustained silent reading, everybody in school is going to read. There are students who are not going to read as well, and sustained silent reading by itself may not be sufficient. Okay. One of the interesting things here is that more NT and NA students in schools with time set aside for reading report that they like reading. Because remember, we're thinking about we're trying to explore what is it that we can do to help lower proficiency students. The first two schools, D and C, are two co-ed government schools. If you look at the NA and NT responses, okay, this might not be clear, 53.3 here, 58.8 here for NT, compared to 46.2 to 38.5 who responded that they like reading. So we need to explore a little bit further, but is the fact that they have a reading program in school more important maybe for these groups of kids? Why is it so? We asked another question about reading duration. Okay, so it's how long can you sustain reading? We give 15 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour, and often you'll find that this lower proficiency readers will tell us they can sustain reading for 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Anything more than that is too long. So if you think about it, sustained silent reading is just about that period of time, right? 15 minutes to 30 minutes. So without sustained silent reading, they don't get any reading done because they don't come from reading homes compared to the high proficiency readers. But because of sustained silent reading, maybe they get some time in the mornings to practice reading. Like I said, our images of sustained silent reading often look, or our images of setting aside time to read often look like that. But I want to raise the question, does it always have to be sustained silent reading? Okay, because I think we're also seeing gaps for students. Some students need help with choosing books. Maybe they're reading the same book because they don't know what book to read. What processes do we have in place in our schools to help students to find the right book, to match them to particular books? Should we have a different program for, say, different kinds of classes? In some classes, should the reading period consist of things like read alouds, book sharings, book talks? Must it always be silent? Okay, so those are some questions for us to think about. Okay, my third point about how to build a reading school is basically to create reading libraries. One of the things that we have discovered from the data is that students who have more books at home tend to visit the public library more, but not necessarily with school libraries. Okay, if you allow me to run you through this very complicated table here in very small print, what matters is this line that's highlighted in blue, in green, and in yellow. Okay, in yellow, you see books owned. So these are the number of books that students have at home, and how often they visit the public library. For our purposes, if you see a double asterisk beside it, it means that the information is statistically significant. So if you look at this, there is some form of significance between public library visit and books owned. That means the more books I have at home, the more likely I am to visit the public library. I think that is true because I think about my own pattern as a parent. I buy a lot of books for my students. I bring them to the library to teach them how to use the library, and then I expect them to borrow books from the library. At some point, I don't buy the books, then they go to the library to get their books. This also means, of course, that students who don't have a lot of books at home may not use the library as often. But if you look at school library visit and the correlation to books owned, there is no correlation to books owned. That means students may not visit the public library, but they will definitely visit the school library if, and the caveat is if, the school library is attractive enough to attract them. I think students, in our observations of school libraries, students use the school libraries for all sorts of things. They use it to study, they use it to do their work, they use it to talk, they use it to sleep, they use it to watch videos on their handphones. They do not necessarily use it to read. But if we know that the school library is such an important place for encouraging reading, then I think we need to amplify the role of the school library within school. In one of our case study schools where the school library was renovated with the aim of reading in mind, what was really interesting was that if you look at this diagram, oops, sorry. If you look at this pie chart over here, one of the things that we did in schools was that we went in to count the number of, in each school, we spent 5 days each term. So up to term 3, we were 15 days in each school, 8 hours each day. We sat in the library and we counted what students were doing in the library. So every 10 minutes to 20 minutes, we would count how many students are there in the library and what are they doing. And if you look at this particular school where reading was emphasized, you would see 21% of the behaviors in term 1 was reading behavior. Reading behavior here included things like browsing, talking about books, sustained reading. This is significant because in all the other schools that we went to, we only observed 2 to 7% reading behaviors. Now, if you look at the school's data from term 1, term 2, and term 3, you will find that it changes. Reading takes up less of the percentage because more things are happening in the library. But if we look at the absolute numbers, we look at our counts, the students' reading remains quite consistent. So this is a reading library. You know, students come in, they borrow the books in this library, they read them. So some examples of the kinds of reading behaviors that we observe in the library. So this particular corner that is set aside for reading, students taking up picture books. So book selection is very important. Students taking picture books and kind of talking about them and exploring them together. A group of boys reading comics in a group. Display strategies to attract the students to browse, to look at the books. What the students say about the library. So again, in our survey, we asked students, what do you like about your library? Very open-ended question. And students said, in relation to reading, students say they like the environment, I love it so much, it's a nice place to read and relax. And the other thing that we found interesting was that students actually said that this library had a lot of books, or had a lot of interesting books, a lot of rare books. But actually this library only has 6,500 books, which is very few, about 3 to 4 books per student. But the books were very well curated, and the books were new, and the students thought that when they came in, they saw something that interested them. So there was the impression that this library was a very well-stocked library. So stock libraries are not necessarily libraries with lots of books. I really like this because it gives a comparison. This is by a Sec 4 or Sec 3 student. He says the library is designed to better focus on our reading because back then our library was very, very dark. So it's like, okay, light, yeah? Well, what students want in their library? So one of the things that we did across the 6 different schools was we asked the same question. And the interesting thing was this. No matter what kind of library they had, so even if they had that very nice library, okay, or if they had a very sort of poorly maintained library, actually we didn't come across any really poorly maintained libraries, but no matter what kind of library they had, even in this particular very nice library with lots of books, the first thing they want is more books, better books, books they want to read. And actually when you talk to teachers, teachers also talk about books. They say we want more books to encourage them to read critically. We want more books to get them into the library. So what I find interesting is that students actually want more books in their library, but we need to think about this concept of what more books should be like and what other things students need. So the question here I have is, how can we build reading libraries? What kind of funding, manpower, support, and training would we need to help our secondary school libraries and primary school libraries become the kind of place where we can encourage reading? And that's a lot of what this project is about. So maybe I just want to end with this. Schools can ensure all students have equitable access to reading by providing resources, time, and opportunities for students to develop reading habits. What matters now is how we make use of what we know to create an environment where our students will want to read. So going back to my main point, basically, I think we have equal access to books in Singapore in terms of, you know, within a particular distance, all of us can walk and we can find a book. Okay, but I think when we talk about equity, we're talking about whether students can actually access the books because they have learned that kind of book reading habit that is so important to helping them sustain this lifelong learning habits. So with that, thank you.